The rain had been falling for hours, turning the cracked pavement into a maze of shallow puddles that mirrored the cold, gray sky. Her coat was too thin for weather like this, clinging to her shoulders like damp paper, and her shoes had long since surrendered to the water seeping in. One arm wrapped protectively around her sleeping daughter, the other held onto the frayed strap of her worn handbag. She had no umbrella, no car, and no more strength left to pretend everything was fine. Her bus had broken down miles back, the last one for the night, and the dark stretch of road ahead felt endless. She stood at the corner, shivering, watching car after car speed past without slowing, each pair of headlights fading into the wet distance like a reminder that the world was always in too much of a hurry for people like her. And then, through the sheets of rain, she saw a black luxury sedan roll up, its tinted windows lowering just enough for a deep, steady voice to ask if she needed a ride. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that a single act of compassion can change a life forever, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Your support helps us keep telling stories that touch hearts and inspire hope. She hesitated, instinctively clutching her little girl closer, her mind warring between fear and desperation. The stranger looked impossibly out of place here, his immaculate suit, the polished interior of his car, the faint scent of expensive cologne drifting through the rain. It was the kind of world she had only ever glimpsed from behind shop windows she could never afford to enter. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see arrogance or pity, she saw something else. Something tired, maybe even lonely. She climbed in, the warmth of the leather seats almost making her want to cry. Her daughter stirred but didn't wake. For the first few minutes, silence filled the car, broken only by the rhythm of the rain on the roof. She didn't know where to begin, and he didn't ask questions right away. The truth was, her life had been a long series of scraped knees and swallowed pride. She had worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, juggling rent, groceries, and daycare while her own dreams collected dust in the back of her mind. Her daughter, Emily, was the only light she had left, the reason she kept going even when everything seemed stacked against her. Tonight had been one of the worst. Her shift at the diner had run late, her babysitter had threatened to quit if she kept coming home past midnight, and then the bus had given out on that lonely stretch of road. She had no one to call. Her phone bill was overdue, and the last friend who used to help her had moved across the country. The man kept his eyes on the road, but she noticed his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel when he passed a dark, empty playground. He drove slowly, as if each turn in the wet streets carried a memory. After a while, he asked where she needed to go. She told him, embarrassed by how small and run down her neighborhood was. But instead of turning away or making an excuse to drop her off elsewhere, he drove her right to the faded building where she lived, slowing down only to make sure she and her little girl didn't have to step into another puddle. She thanked him quietly, ready to disappear into the shadows of her apartment block. That's when he surprised her by saying her name, not "ma'am" or "miss," but her actual name. She froze, confused. He explained that he had seen her before, at the diner where she worked nights. She always smiled at the customers, even the ones who treated her like she was invisible. He had noticed how she'd sometimes slip a small dessert to an elderly man who came in alone, even though it was never on his bill. She didn't know what to say. He didn't linger, just gave her a small nod before driving off. But that moment stayed with her. Days passed, and she went back to her routine of exhaustion and survival, thinking she'd never see him again. But he came into the diner a few nights later, taking a booth in the far corner. This time, he stayed after the rush died down. He asked if she could sit for a minute, and against her better judgment, she did. That's when he told her something she hadn't expected. He was the CEO of a large company, a millionaire many times over. But none of it mattered anymore, not since his wife and young son had been killed in a car accident 2 years ago. He had been drifting through life since then, burying himself in work and shutting out the world. Seeing her that rainy night, holding her child like the world could take her away at any second, had reminded him of something he thought he'd lost forever, the will to care again. From then on, small changes began to happen. He'd stop by the diner once a week, sometimes leaving an envelope with a tip so generous it made her want to cry. But he never made her feel like a charity case. Instead, he encouraged her, asked about her dreams, and eventually, one day, offered her a job at his company, not out of pity, but because he said she had the kind of determination no resume could capture. It was terrifying to leave the diner, but it was also a chance she couldn't refuse. Slowly, her life began to shift. She could pay her bills on time. Emily had better clothes for school. The constant weight pressing on her chest started to lift. And in the quiet moments, she began to notice something else, the way his eyes softened when he watched her laugh, the way he seemed to listen to her more intently than anyone else ever had. But this wasn't a fairy tale where everything was perfect overnight. They both carried scars, invisible and deep. There were moments when he would retreat into silence, and she wouldn't know how to reach him. There were nights she lay awake, afraid this was all temporary, that life would take it away just as quickly as it had given it. Yet, each time, they found their way back to each other, through shared dinners, through Emily's giggles that lit up the room, through conversations that stretched into the small hours of the morning. It took months before either of them dared to speak the truth, but when they did, it felt less like a confession and more like a homecoming. He told her he hadn't just given her a ride that rainy night, she had unknowingly given him one too, away from the loneliness he'd been drowning in. And she realized that what she'd thought was the kindness of a stranger had become something deeper, something neither of them had planned but both desperately needed. If this story has touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection, so we can keep sharing real and emotional journeys like this one. And if you believe love can heal even the deepest wounds, leave a comment, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Special request. Comment, kindness changes everything, if you believe in the power of compassion to transform lives. In the weeks that followed their first real conversation outside the diner, the threads of their lives began to intertwine in ways neither of them had expected. He, Daniel Whitmore, had spent years in a world of boardrooms, luxury hotels, and private jets, yet it felt strangely hollow. For all his wealth, his penthouse apartment felt like an empty shell, the silence inside it heavy with memories he was too afraid to face. She, Grace Miller, had lived in cramped apartments with thin walls, where every creak of the floorboards was a reminder of how fragile her security was. And yet, when they were together, whether in the polished lobby of his company or the tiny kitchen of her apartment, it was as if they both stepped into a space untouched by the past, where they could simply breathe. Grace was careful at first, not wanting to mistake gratitude for affection. She had been let down before, by promises that sounded like salvation but crumbled into nothing. But Daniel didn't rush her. He didn't try to fix her life overnight, didn't wave his wealth like a magic wand. Instead, he showed up in small ways. He would drop by the diner before her last day there just to walk her home, standing in the rain without complaint. He would bring Emily a small stuffed animal or a storybook, never anything too extravagant, but chosen with care. And when Grace finally started her new position at his company as an administrative assistant, he quietly made sure her desk had a view of the city skyline, knowing she'd once told him she loved watching sunsets. Daniel found himself smiling again, real, unforced smiles that reached his eyes. But his healing wasn't without struggle. There were days when the weight of his grief returned, sudden and fierce. On one of those days, Grace found him sitting alone in his office long after everyone had left, staring at a framed photo of his late wife and son. She didn't say anything. She simply sat beside him, placing her hand over his, letting the quiet stretch between them like a bridge. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to cry in front of someone. The seasons began to change, and with them, so did Grace's life. She learned to walk into the office with her head held high, no longer the exhausted waitress hoping for enough tips to cover rent. Emily blossomed too, no longer worrying about whether the lights would stay on or if dinner would be scarce. Grace even began to dream again, about finishing her degree, about traveling, about maybe, one day, finding a home that didn't just feel safe but truly hers. One evening, Daniel invited them both to his home for dinner. Grace had never seen the inside of such a place, floor-to-ceiling windows, art that looked like it belonged in a museum, and a kitchen that gleamed like it had been polished for hours. Yet it didn't feel cold or intimidating. Emily ran through the living room with giggles echoing off the high ceilings, while Daniel cooked pasta himself, insisting he didn't trust anyone else to get it just right. They ate together at a table far too large for 3 people, but somehow it felt intimate. Grace caught herself laughing more than she had in years, her cheeks aching in the best way. It was after Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked around her, that Daniel finally told Grace the full story of the night they met. He admitted that he'd been driving aimlessly that evening, unable to bear the quiet of his home. He had no destination, no reason to turn down that particular street, except, maybe, something greater guiding him. Seeing her standing there, drenched but holding her child as though shielding her from the entire world, had struck something deep inside him. He said it wasn't pity that made him stop, it was recognition. He knew what it was to feel like you were carrying the world alone. Grace felt her throat tighten. She realized that while she had been thinking of him as the man who saved her from a cold night on the side of the road, he had been thinking of her as the person who unknowingly pulled him back toward life. The months turned into a year, and somewhere along the way, they stopped pretending their connection was anything less than love. It wasn't the whirlwind romance of movies, it was steadier, quieter, built brick by brick through trust, laughter, and shared moments. Daniel didn't just become part of Grace's life, he became part of Emily's too. He went to school recitals, cheered her on at soccer games, and helped her with math homework, pretending to be baffled by fractions so she could teach him. Grace often thought back to that rainy night. If the bus hadn't broken down, if he had taken a different turn, if she had let fear win and refused the ride, none of this would have happened. Life had a way of hiding its greatest gifts in the most inconvenient, even painful moments. And sometimes, a stranger with a broken heart could turn out to be the missing piece you didn't even know you needed. If this story has touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection, so we can keep bringing you true-to-life stories of hope, love, and second chances. And if you believe that compassion has the power to change the course of someone's life, leave a comment, we'd love to read your thoughts. Special request. Comment, kindness changes everything. If you believe that one small act of generosity can create a ripple that lasts a lifetime.